All right, let's try again. So, hello and welcome everybody to the launch of the 2023 edition of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. We thank you all for joining us today, both in person at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, as well as online via Zoom. We are extremely honored to have with us today His Excellency Mr. Akom Dompitiya Paisit, who is the Minister of Finance of Thailand. To his left, we have Ms. Armida Salcia Alice Jabana, Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. On my right, we have Mr. Hamza Malik, who is the Director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at ESCAP. And then on the far right there is Mr. Vacharin Siri Manitam, Chief of the Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis Section at MPFD. His team is the main author of the survey that we're going to be discussing this morning. The survey, just by way of brief introduction, the survey is one of the flagship publications of ESCAP. The theme this year is on rethinking public debt for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it presents new, and we hope interesting, perspectives on fiscal and public debt analysis that helps Asia and the Pacific to effectively pursue the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that bit of introduction, let me now hand over the floor to Madam Executive Secretary, who has some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Excellency Minister, Mr. Arkom Terpintaya Paisit, Minister of Finance of Thailand, distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's launch of the 2023 edition of the survey, ESCAP, one of ESCAP flagship publication. Actually, it is also the oldest publication, flagship publication of ESCAP, predated since it was first launched in 1947. 1947, the year ESCAP was established. So the survey has been providing policymakers with insightful analysis on emerging macroeconomic and socio-economic challenges facing the region. This year, 2023, is particularly challenging, and we are far from realizing, of course, the SDGs. Chronic development as well as environmental deficits have been deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, climate change as well as the war in Ukraine. The fiscal space needed to address these challenges has been severely affected. Likewise, so not only the challenges, but at the same time, the fiscal space also. First by the pandemic, war in Ukraine, and of course, climate change. And currently, I think many countries are facing this high inflation, rising interest rates, as well as growth, the so-called stagflation. As in an increasing number of developing economies in our region, including in our region, are running high levels of public debt and experiencing rising public debt distress at a time when they need to invest heavily to ensure this inclusive, resilient, sustainable well-being for all the people or SDGs. Focusing on public debt assessment, this year's survey offers new perspectives on how developing countries in the region can rise to the challenge of managing high public debt while stepping up financial investment in the SDGs. It proposes the so-called augmented approach to DSSA, or debt sustainability analysis, that also incorporates national SDG financing needs and financing strategies, along with the socio-economic and environmental benefits of public investment. So the so-called augmented debt sustainability analysis. It also recommends sovereign debt restructuring that is neither too little nor too late for countries at high risk of debt distress, and that is also fair for both debtor countries and creditors. I look forward to the support of members of the media in disseminating the survey's important messages widely. There is a need to promote greater public awareness of the need for urgent policy action to tackle the rising public debt distress, while continuing to invest in the SDGs at all levels, national, regional, as well as global. So with that, I will now would like to hand over maybe back to you, Mitch. Yeah, before, of course, Excellency Minister.
Thank you, Madam Executive Secretary. Yes, now it's my pleasure and honor to turn the floor over to His Excellency Mr. Akorn Dampitya Paisit, the Minister of Finance of Thailand, for his keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and very good morning to all of you. Kun Amida Sausia, Alice Jabana, Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of the ESCAP, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is always my pleasure to express keynote and address at the launch of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2023, rethinking public debt for the Sustainable Development Goals. As the Undersecretary just mentioned, that public debt and I just want to add not only the public debt but also the household debt are always the issue of the Thai economy. But the question is how we services the debt for the future to the debt sustainability. However, in facing the lessons learned from the 1997 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we recognize that vulnerabilities in the financial system can eventually become a fiscal burden. This shows the role of the Thai government as the fiscal backstop that will help stop the escalation of the financial and economic crisis. It is important for governments to maintain fiscal discipline and manage public debt to achieve sustainable development, and it is essential to balance economic growth with fiscal responsibility. Therefore, we need to rethink the public debt management in a way that the social, economic, and environmental impacts is taken into consideration. In Thailand, public debt management plays a crucial role, particularly during the COVID-19. In order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the Thai economy, the government has issued two emergency loan decrees in the past 2 years, amounting to 1.5 trillion Thai baht, equivalent to 44 billion US dollar. The implementation of these measures has resulted in a remarkable increase in economic growth and employment rates, while also stabilize the healthcare system. As of February 2023, our debt to GDP ratio was at the 61.13%, which is below our ceiling of the 70%. The fiscal space of the about 9% provides flexibility for the government to introduce fiscal measures to cope with crisis and boost the economy if needed. Even though our funding needs have been double, our fiscal position has remained strong throughout the pandemic. This was reaffirmed by all rating agencies that Thailand has the manageable debt level with strong support from the domestic bond market. Our country's sustained economic growth, resilient financial sector, and prudent management of public finances have all contributed to this positive outlook. In addition to the debt to GDP ratio, we also take other risk indicators into account to ensure that our debt remains sustainable. To monitor our debt affordability, we use the interest to revenue ratio with a highly conservative target of below 10%, which links to an upper medium investment grade rating according to sovereign credit ratings. Moreover, our foreign debt ratio is as low as 1.6% of the total public debt, which indicates that external factors such as exchange rates are unlikely to have a significant impact on our financial stability. Additionally, our debt structure is mostly long-term, resulting in an average time to maturity of around 9 years, which help us maintain a low refinancing risk. Furthermore, we recognize the importance of transparency and accountability in public debt management. This can help build trust and confidence in the government ability manage public debt sustainability. Thailand has a clear and transparent public debt management strategy with processes for managing public debt, monitoring operations under the Public Debt Management Plan, reporting on the results of plan implementation, and following sustainable fiscal frameworks. For sustainable development goals, the Thai government is dedicated to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, specifically in addressing climate change and social issues. This commitment is reflected in the national strategy that prioritizes sustainable, inclusive, and environmentally friendly economic growth. Achieving these goals requires not only policy efforts, but also innovative financial investment and collaboration from all stakeholders in the financial market. In this regard, the Ministry of Finance has been one of key catalysts in providing the financing tools to support the Thai government's actions towards social and environmental development. The Sustainability Bond Program has enabled the government to address its funding requirements during the COVID-19, while also contributing to the achievement of the UN SDG. Very recently, like just last week, we had the ASEAN Finance Minister and Governors meeting for 2023. And one of the key achievements is the ASEAN has already issued the taxonomy for sustainable financing. This is a clear guideline. This is the version 1, and version 2 is coming. So it's a clear guideline not only for the government sector, but also the private sector to follow what kind of the activities or what kind of the projects that the financing sources can be helped in to address the climate change issues. As for the Ministry of Finance, we issued the first sustainability bonds in August 2020, and now the total amount has reached 317 billion baht to support green and social projects. These bonds accelerate private sector and state-owned enterprises' investment in sustainable initiatives and contribute towards building a secure and sustainable economy in Thailand. As a result, the total value of green, social, and sustainability bonds has grown from 22 billion baht in 2020 to 91 billion baht in 2022. Just yesterday, I just met one of the new CEO of the global banks and has been helping Thailand in the bond market, facilitating our issuance of the bond. And one of the discussion is how how the role of the global banks or even the local banks can support for the green economy in order to achieve the SDG as well. Ladies and gentlemen, for the collaboration, we recognize the importance of close collaboration with relevant agencies such as the Bank of Thailand and, as I said, a financial institution. Frequent communication and cooperation will allow the Ministry of Finance to adjust its financing strategy in response to changing market, in order to changing market conditions and investor demands. This will help us avoid potential crowding out effect and ensure the efficient allocation of resources towards sustainable and socially beneficial projects. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, as long as the public debt can be managed and the incurred debt is carefully taken into account, the cost-benefit analysis, long-term economic stability, along with all 17 SDGs, can be achieved and maintained. Finally, the challenge that everyone is facing is not the rising public debt level, but more importantly, how we balance our portfolio and utilize the budget efficiently to ensure our economic growth, sustainability, resiliency, and inclusiveness, in which I believe that the collaboration between the government and private sector is crucial for the success. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope to stay with all of you during lunchtime, but I have the meeting with the Prime Minister on some important agenda. So once again, thank you very much and congratulations for the ESCAP to launch the economic surveys for 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency.
I can leave, right? My colleague will be here.
Okay. She's coming back, but she's not. Okay, thank you. We now turn to the actual findings of the report. Our next two speakers, Hamza and Vat, will share their insights. Let me start with Hamza, who has a brief introduction to share with everybody about the report's findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Excellencies. Thank you very much for coming to our launch event of the Economic and Social Survey 2023. I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of main messages and some of the details, I think my team has prepared a video. So let's watch this short video to get the salient messages, hopefully visually, and then we can get with the main discussion.
The economic performance in 2022 and near-term prospects remain weak in Asia and the Pacific due to the global economic slowdown, elevated inflation, and uncertainty induced by the war in Ukraine. The surge in global food and energy prices is particularly affecting the poor and is causing a rise in inequalities. The region needs to increase investments in food security and accelerate the transition towards renewable energy. The high cost of living is also worsening the deep socio-economic scarring from the pandemic. Restoring price stability is thus critical for attaining the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in the region. Central banks are increasing interest rates to tackle inflation, but support from targeted fiscal measures needs to cope with the higher cost of living. But fiscal space is constrained and government debt levels are rising. At the same time, financing needs to effectively pursue the SDGs remain large. Climate-related financing needs for mitigation and adaptation and for dealing with climate-induced disasters and losses and damage are also weighing on fiscal positions. To meet these challenges, the Survey 2023 argues for increasing fiscal revenues, improving public spending efficiency and effectiveness, and better public debt management. Countries facing severe debt distress should also consider preemptive, swift, and adequate debt restructuring. International development community can also play a significant role in facilitating coordinated discussions among debtor and creditor countries and in accelerating progress toward common international debt resolution frameworks. Assessing public debt profiles more deeply, Survey 2023 argues that public debt can be a powerful tool if used judiciously, and higher debt levels do not always mean higher debt distress or default risk. Survey 2023 calls for a revisit of public debt sustainability assessment approaches and proposes an augmented approach that can complement conventional assessments. Taking a long-term view, this approach incorporates SDG investment needs and financing strategies, together with government's structural development policies. It shows that large socio-economic and environmental benefits of investments in SDGs help reduce public debt in the long run. Thus, Survey 2023 shows a path forward to deal with debt-related challenges at a time when global well-being is threatened by conflict, economic worries, and climate change.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of some of these messages. So next slide, please. So broadly, I would like to leave you with, in our report, 5 main messages. First is on the overall economic performance. In our assessment, the GDP growth in Asia and the Pacific developing economies is likely to remain weak in 2023-2024, amid essentially 3 main reasons: global economic slowdown, elevated inflation levels across the board, and war-induced uncertainties affecting many aspects of the economic performance. A special zero-in or zooming in this survey is on fiscal and debt issues. Essentially, this issue becomes all the more important when we try to balance the needs to invest in SDGs and climate action in an environment when interest rates are increasing and countries are already facing higher debt distress as the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, for instance. So that's the lens, actually, that's the primary focus of our assessment or research in this particular issue of the economic survey. So specifically, what we are essentially saying is call for a rethink on how we think about assessing debt concerns, debt distress, debt assessment methodologies, and we essentially propose what we're calling an augmented approach, augmenting as a complementary approach to the existing approaches used by IMF and World Bank and other international agencies. And my colleague Brad will take you through exactly what this augmented approach is all about. So essentially what we are offering for the member states is the menu of options when they want to assess debt conditions. They should at least pay attention to our augmented approach because it incorporates explicitly the SDG investment requirements among other considerations. Of course, as economists and anybody who looks at the debt issues, the first line of defense is strengthening fiscal positions. The three broad areas. One is paying attention to increasing fiscal revenues. Other is on public spending efficiency. And third, of course, is public debt management, which are essentially critical for sustained debt sustainability in many, many countries. So there's a lot of discussion in the survey on these issues. And last but not least, something that we are at ESCAP is engaged with the global UN agencies also, is the role of international development community. UN, IMF, and World Bank and others who are engaged on debt issues, there's a need to have much more coordinated debtor-creditor discussions in a much more structured manner. And there is certainly a huge gap when it comes to coming on terms with common international debt resolution framework. That still does not exist. There are broad principles that are out there, but there's a need for accelerating progress and the adoption of some of these international debt resolution frameworks going forward. Next slide. So just to show you some visuals, very briefly, there are two things you can see. This is the GDP growth performance of the region, and the right panel is the inflation performance. I just want you to notice two things. One, the red line is actually our latest projections and forecast and assessment compared to the blue dotted line. So first thing to notice is our assessment shows that GDP in the region on average is going to be lower than what we were expecting last year. It's expected to be around 3.3% in 2022. We estimate that to be the case, and compared to 4.5% last year. And it's likely to inch up gradually, but not much. Second thing to notice is we are still going to be lower than the recent historical performance of the region, which was hovering around 5.5% on average, but post-COVID still we are going to be below that historical performance. Of course, the middle dip you see is the effect of the pandemic. Similar situation we can see on the right-hand panel on inflation side, a significant higher than expected increase in inflation has occurred. Inflation, actual inflation, estimated inflation in 2022, on average in Asia and the Pacific has been 7.6% compared to what we were expecting last year, around 5.2%, which has implications, of course, on the monetary policy side. For instance, we expect higher interest rate increases or more interest rate increases in more and more countries of the region. Next slide. So both slowing economy and high inflation is an anathema to macro policy makers. It poses very difficult policy questions, policy trade-offs. It has severe implications on the pursuit of SDGs, for instance, among other things. Here's a few examples. It tends to lead to subdued employment conditions and a significant loss in purchasing power, which in turn has impact on increase in poverty and continuation of rising income inequality trends. Because a major component of increasing inflation is coming from food side, there are concerns on the food insecurity and malnutrition as well. Then there are concerns on school dropouts, which affect essentially the long-term productivity and learning outcomes in an economy. And most importantly, given the focus of our research this year on fiscal issues, lower economic performance, for instance, tends to lead to lower government revenues, which leaves relatively little room for governments to respond to many crises, to try and help the people through various fiscal support measures. Next slide, please. So what are the main risks we see going forward that actually informs our outlook that I just shared? Three broad ones. Continued geopolitical uncertainty. It has, again, as I mentioned very briefly, and you'll find more discussion in the report, has many impacts. It keeps, for instance, the aggregate demand weak. Both consumption and investment are unlikely to pick up in a significant manner because of this uncertainty. And there is risks of prolonged economic downturn along with the persistence of inflation at a high level. The second one is, and there is a debate still going on, the sharper than expected economic slowdown in the advanced economies outside the region. So Asia Pacific, of course, as we know, is a major global export engine of the global economy. It ends up, the global economic slowdown ends up having an adverse effect on the region's exports prospects, which in turn, of course, has the impact on their economic performance. And the third, probably more important one is, if the inflation continues to persist at high levels, the chances are, the likelihood that interest rates are going to increase even further is going to be very high, which in turn has a feedback effect on debt service payments for many, many countries. So understanding this links between economic slowdown, high inflation, higher interest rates, having an impact on economic distress is actually one of the main messages, you can say, or things that we want you to reflect on, or you can find more details in the report. In terms of policy considerations, there are many. The main salient features, of course, is wherever there is room available in countries, for the fiscal side, they should actually intervene and provide support to people to cushion them from the impact of high inflation, especially from food items. Similarly, the discussion on the importance of timely interest rate adjustments is going to be critical. Many developing countries might feel that they don't need to increase interest rates as quickly as they would, as inflation data calls. But if the advanced economies like US continues to increase interest rates, some countries may face capital outflow pressures or exchange rate depreciation pressures. So sooner or later, they will have to actually increase interest rates. So taking a decision in a timely manner on interest rate front is extremely important to ensure price stability and actually anchor inflation expectations, which in turn actually provides a very stable platform for sustained economic performance. Clear economic policy communication on this front is critical. Delays ends up costing economies much more than they realize. We have seen several examples in the region when such decisions are delayed. And of course, while countries are pursuing or supporting near-term economic performance, they should not lose sight of investing in a resilient, inclusive, and green economic development of the region, which in turn has benefits actually across the board. So this is a basic snapshot of the economic performance. This is, so you can say, one of the main parts of the Economic Social Survey. The other part actually deals with the research theme, which changes every year. This year, the research theme is on debt issues, and for that, I'll invite my colleague, Vacherin, to actually take us through. Thanks, Matt.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to the theme of the report on the debt. Selectively, we'll start with the revisiting the nexus between public debt and development. And for this, at the bigger picture, we highlight some of the current thinking and also our proposal on the way forward. The first one, we talk about debt, whether it is personal debt, household debt, country government debt. Debt is generally a negative term. Okay, so in traditional thinking is that debt is bad for economic growth. Our new thinking is that it really depends on public debt can be a powerful tool to attain the SDG, but essentially conditional on using this wisely and also with the long-term horizon. It's depending on how you use your debt. And the second point is that there's belief about the common debt threshold. There's a big literature which, after all, suggests that about 60% of GDP, if the government debt exceeds this 60% of GDP, then the economic growth will fall. And this informs the sort of suggested debt threshold by the international financial institution that countries should not exceed this magical 60%. But our argument is that it's really country-specific, just like person, firms. Okay, it depending on how the government is using this, where they stand on the SDG progress and how they want to move forward. Whether they're still far. Our colleague just released another report which showed that the region as a whole, we are still really far from achieving the SDG by 2030. On the last point, the current methodology, because they focus on, basically by the IMF and the World Bank, is focusing on the maintaining the short-term debt sustainability. Short-term means up to 5 years, which reflect their operational nature of borrowing program. But unfortunately, in many cases, this has led to the painful fiscal consolidation in many countries. Government cut the spending, leading to unemployment and increasing the poverty. This is the well-known fact. At the same time, that limiting the access of government to the financing. And for this, that's why we need to revamp the methodology, not so much to replace, let me emphasize, but to supplement the existing methodology. And this is our proposal, which contained in this survey this year. We call it, as you heard many times today, augmented public debt sustainability analysis. Essentially, it comprises of 4 components. The first one is about a country, for each country, additional spending need to meet the SDG. Okay, and the second is structural development reform. And the third is how you finance the SDG financing need, which is typically really large for many countries. And the last is the stress test and realization of the contingent liability. And to illustrate how this works, in the report, we had the Mongolia as a pilot case study. So along these four components, we look at the literature review. For Mongolia, the country require about 17% of GDP additional per year until 2030, which is the big amount. And most of this is on the transport infrastructure and equally on the climate action. So we come up with our structural development policy as if in the real world, government also pursue SDG. At the same time, they also introduce other reform. In this particular case, we highlight the green economy and also the diversified economy, which reflect the key development challenges of Mongolia. And as the country move forward and how they finance this SDG financing need, we look at the public finance, increasing, especially increase the quality of the tax administration, how you leverage the potential of the informal economy, and how you engage with the debt for climate swap to reduce the debt burden. And the analysis also assumes a certain policy on how to mobilize private finance, including engaging more with the private sector, especially in the infrastructure project, as well as a range of the country-specific stress tests for Mongolia. And the result, which is based on the macro modeling, is the simplified version is just this two chart, and the next chart I will show it to you. The bottom line is that once we assume a lot of many that I show you, okay, this is the result. After all, this policy package is good for the people in a way that it helps reduce poverty incidence. And even though the numbers may seem low, at about 3%, it's actually really sizable compared to the poverty rate in Mongolia, which is only about 10%. So we are talking about 1/3 reduction in the poverty. And also the carbon emission, which is a big, air pollution is a big problem for Mongolia because of the coal-based economy. It helps to reduce the, according to this analysis, to reduce the carbon emission by about 20% in the long run. And because of this, there are many drivers, such as the increase in energy efficiency. You have more renewable energy used in the country energy mix, as well as the reduced biodiversity loss. All good so far, but how about the impact of this on government debt? Okay, remember that we assume that the SDG spending need is 70% of GDP. So naturally, without any other accompanying policy, then the government debt will be much higher. If the Mongolia spend on SDG spending alone, which is reflected in the green line on the top one, then the government debt ratio will surge almost to 150% of GDP. But as in reality, government also pursue other structural reform which help to reduce this debt level. They also explore how to mobilize the fiscal resource to leverage the private sector for key development projects and all of this. And then we come up with the red line, which is what we call the combined scenario. We include everything. And the key thing is that eventually after some 20 years, the public debt level convert to the baseline scenario. And this baseline scenario, underlying that, is that it assumes fiscal consolidation. That's why you see the downward trend from the very beginning toward the end. But after some years, it converts. But the key difference is that, as I showed before, the people and environment are much better off. So beyond this new methodology, we look at the policy-oriented messages. The first part is about how you strengthen the fiscal policy, and especially for the country in which you are still relatively think of Thailand in a relatively comfortable position. And this is something that the country may do. And later we will focus on the countries which are already in a debt distress or close to that, and what those countries can do. For the region as a whole, we see that by 2021, which is 1 year after the pandemic started, the government debt level increased to the 18-year high level. Emphasize that actually before the pandemic, as you can see from the chart, back in 2019, the public debt was already rising. Okay, and together with the pandemic and this jump, and there are many factors which drive the increasing debt. In this analysis, we show that especially for this region, the red part, which is the primary fiscal deficit, basically government subtract by the expenditure, is the key driver which has been driving the increasing debt level in the region. In contrast, you look at the green part, which is the difference between interest rate and economic growth. The bottom line is that as long as the economic growth exceeds the interest rate, then that is good because the government debt tend to come down. Okay, but the bad news is that in the past, this green has been constraining the increase in the debt, but going forward, economic growth will be lower, interest rate will be higher. So what helped economy, what helped the region in the past is not going to help region going forward, which is a big concern. And on top of this, we look at the three-pronged strategy on how to enhance the fiscal resources for the SDG. The first one is to increase the fiscal revenue. And we look at how the country can increase the quality of the tax administration to boost the tax revenue and also go to the non-tax revenue for some country. That's the booming real estate economy sector as well as the digital economy, how you actually tap the potential of this industry. And importantly, the report argued that do not wait until you having a debt default. Donor countries should step up their development transfer today rather than helping the country sort out the debt restructuring later. So the chart shows you that all of this is possible and has been done. So in countries such as Armenia, Nepal, Micronesia, Cambodia, and Maldives, in the past decade, they have enjoyed a steep increase in the government tax ratio. But also importantly, if you compare to the rightmost bar, that is the SDG spending need for the least developed country. So the extent that country can boost that tax policy is still relatively small compared to the need that they have to spend. And the second area is on the improving public spending efficiency, which the minister also touched upon this point. The overall goal is to have the spending value for money with a big impact. So when the government borrow, it's clearly important to think how you're going to use this fund. One example that we give here is to align this public expenditure with the SDG priority, which is the country specific. And the second, at the micro level, is to do this project selection, oversight. At the big picture, the chart shows you that across the Asia-Pacific economy, when the public debt level increased, this is not the case that the social spending, particularly on health and education, also increased. For developed country, which is the far right of the panel, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, when the debt increased, the simple correlation tends to show that the social spending also increased, which is also true for South and Southwest Asia, but this is unfortunately not the case yet for other Asia-Pacific sub-regions. And third and last on this fiscal space is to improve how you manage the public debt stock. First, we know that you need to have a clear debt management objective. You borrow for what and to what level, okay? And in many countries, they're still unclear of how actually which government agency are managing the public debt, whether it's a central bank or it's a dedicated unit or part of the Ministry of Finance. And also you need to be aware of the current situation by having a timely collection, reporting, as well as the prudent portfolio, which means that there's a risk management. If the interest rate increase, if the exchange rate depreciate, how is that going to affect your debt stock? The chart shows you the one of the key feature, which is still quite a lot of missing in the Asia Pacific, is that country they do not fully realize the extent of the contingent liability. Once it happens, how much it would cost the fiscal, which can be really large. in some country in the past, especially the stimulus, especially the rescue package to help the banking sector during the Asian financial crisis. Okay, the last part of the presentation is about, unfortunately, you have been doing this revenue, expending, and public debt management, but the country is close to already in a debt distress. So the way, one of the way forward is to do this public debt restructuring. And at the big picture, we see that the country in the region, which has been rated according to the conventional methodology, okay, is increasing in the region. Latest is about 19 countries, and the table show you the list. The bottom line of this list is that if you look at them carefully, many of them are small, vulnerable, and with a relatively limited development level. Basically, they need help. Okay, they're trying to do things that they can, but also our point is about international commodity. So, but this restructuring by itself is already quite complicated because of the conflict of interest, and whether it's actually the fault of the debtor country or how to what extent creditor can help. One factor which complicates this further is the rise of the unconventional creditor, which is basically the bondholder with an institutional investor or the household, and as well as the official creditor, particularly China. Basically, you have more party to negotiate when you need to do the restructuring. And on the last one, how can the international development community, UN, institutional financial institution, development partner, donor country can do? Okay, the first part is to strengthen the so-called G20 common framework for the debt institution, which is the follow-up from the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or DSSI. At the moment, for example, middle-income country, regardless of how much they are vulnerable to the climate shock, they're still not eligible for this framework. And private creditor, which I just showed you that is increasingly important, is not part of this framework. The second one is more technical, but easily to understand, is when government has a borrowing contract, then you have this collective action process, so that once the decision by most people needs to be complied by all the creditors, so that you avoid the dropout of some creditor. And also, especially important for some countries, state contingent clauses, when the natural disaster hit, whether the debt repayment can be postponed by 3 to 5 years or not. And the last one, which is key thing, is to have this common framework on this negotiation rather than case-by-case basis, which is really time-consuming. And going beyond this report, we are happy to introduce the public debt dashboard for Asia and the Pacific, which is a common good. It will be launched on the website today. Basically, our analysis based on this new dashboard is the way that you can play around at the country level, sub-regional level. Is also include the level and also composition of public debt across the individual Asia-Pacific economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fat, for that deep dive into the report's theme this year. We do have a little bit of time for Q&A, so I'd like to turn it over to the room to see if there's any questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and your affiliation, and also which of the two speakers you'd like to direct your question to. Marwan, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Marwan Markham, Nikkei Asia, as to Dr. Bacharin. You summed up the increase in debt to GDP across the region, reaching record highs since 2000, over the last 18 years. How much, and of course there was a link with COVID spending, how much of it in this region was the result of IMF, World Bank recommendations for countries to open up their purse strings and provide money at a time when the economies were feeling trouble as a result of COVID? That's my first question. And the other thing that seems to be absent here is the word austerity. Nobody mentioned that, and I'm just curious, as governments now are asked to consolidate their expenses, pursue fiscal consolidation, how is that going to affect austerity measures? Is it going to become a big issue in this region? Thank you.
Let me start with, and VAT can fill in. The first part, as VAT showed, the increase in debt started well before the pandemic. We can pull out the graph again. It started increasing 2012, 2013 onwards. So pandemic simply accelerated the increase in debt that was taking place, taking it to all-time high, not all-time high, high of last 18 years. In numbers, the jump between 2019, the pre-pandemic level was around 41%, and after pandemic, it's actually around 2021, 49% of GDP on average, right? So there is significant jump increase, but the point to note coming from your question is the increase was happening before that already. Second point is actually much more interesting. We have been very careful. The term austerity or fiscal consolidation has many implications. So what our advice in the report is the countries need to undertake these measures very, very carefully. Don't jump on it. The typical policy response tends to be the country is deemed to be facing a high debt distress, are recommended by IMF and World Bank in particular to introduce fiscal consolidation measures or austerity measures. What we document in the report is it ends up having a very drastic impact on lower economic growth, increase in poverty, rising inequalities, and so on and so forth. So what we are saying is when you're assessing the debt position, don't jump to conclusions. Don't have a short-term horizon only. Next 4 or 5 years, yes, things are difficult if debts are going up and debt servicing cost is going up. That's what our assessment showed is once you internalize the potential benefits of investing in SDGs, it actually pays off in the long term. So you can actually avoid is not the right word, undertake fiscal consolidation a little more judiciously, a little more at a slower pace, a little deliberate manner, if you manage to have a long-term horizon, and assuming that the debt that you're incurring is actually being invested in SDGs. So that's a differing view, that's a complementary or augmented view that we are proposing, that high debt distress doesn't mean you start implementing austerity measures. We're saying assess it much more carefully, have a long-term horizon, use the debt to invest in SDGs, and then what you actually see is the debt level might converge to same outcomes that you could have achieved, that you would have achieved under the fiscal consolidation or austerity measures. But the benefits to the people, as VAT was highlighting, is much more in terms of reduction in poverty, carbon emissions, and there are many, many other things we can see from that. You want to add anything, VAT, to this?
Yes. Okay. One of the ultimate objective of this augmented analysis is not really to specify at which spending level or which policy to use. Okay, actually it gives you options, like looking forward, these are some of the trajectory. If you do this according to our analysis, this is going to happen. Okay, it's still really, the bottom line is that it still really depends on the government. If Mongolia, let's say, for example, think 17% is too high, then if you want to afford 10%, okay, and this analysis show you the government debt will be lower, but at the same time, the benefit to people and environment will be lower as well. So it's about the balancing act, and we do not actually saying that the government should be like all out, go all out to borrow as many as possible, but it's more about what you do with the money that you get from this borrowing.
Thank you. Any other questions from here in the room? Now, Mahesh, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I don't need an introduction, but just in terms of the recommendation of the survey about international cooperation in debt management, and we saw the instantaneous response by the international community in the form of the DSSI, and now the G20, and now it has been picked up in terms of the common debt management framework beyond the DSSI. But there has been a criticism from a section that, of economists that this has been primarily a creditor-driven initiative, which does not take into account the interests of developing countries, which really do not have a place on the board of OECD, which is responsible for administering it. So is there a feeling that the multilateral credit debt management initiatives post DSSI are sort of not participatory enough?
Okay, let me start with that. Thanks, Mahesh. Of course, there are weaknesses in the G20 framework for debt treatments. They have been pointed out already. So there are 3 parts to the entire debt resolution framework. 3 parts, let's say. Number 1, how to provide debt relief in a broader sense. DSSI was one example of that initiative that was undertook. It phased out by 2021. Debt standstill is another one. Debt write-off is another example of debt relief, right? There are examples of debt relief. So you need to have a framework, an agreed upon principle-based framework that tells you if A, B, C things happen, then this will be kick in, this kind of debt relief will kick in. We don't have that at the moment globally. They are all case-based assessments that are undertaken. Then in the G20 framework, there are other considerations, other weaknesses that came forth. For instance, it does not include middle-income countries by definition, although some middle-income countries are facing high debt distress. So they were pushed back from that. Then private creditors, and as Vat was explaining, the debt landscape has become very complicated. In the older days, there used to be major bilateral lenders or creditors. Now it's much more complicated with bondholders and private creditors as well. They do not participate in these kind of things. So when you talk about the second part, other than debt relief, debt restructuring, you have to engage with a much more complicated landscape, and that creates complications. So these are the features that need to become part of G20. The third thing is directly to your question, how inclusive the G20 framework is. Well, UN, as you know, has come up with these broad 9 principles for a long time. And they have been engaging with G20, as with many other things, to try and translate those broad principles into actual debt resolution framework. So they are supportive, of the G20 example, the lead, but there is a call for actually exactly what you were saying, to make this framework much more inclusive, to have those countries a say in what are the principles going to be when you go ahead with either debt relief or debt restructuring or other ways to resolve the debt distress. So it's a work in progress in a nutshell, basically we're saying, and that's exactly what at the moment United Nations is trying to go after, working closely with IMF and World Bank, working closely with Paris Club, working closely with G20 Secretariat to try to come up with some broad, globally agreed upon, rule-based debt resolution frameworks that encompasses all these 3 aspects: debt relief, debt restructuring, and coordinated discussions.
Thank you, Hamza. So we have come to the end of our time here this morning. But before we wrap up, I would like to maybe just ask Hamza and or Vat if there are any final words, final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the...
No, nothing. I just want to thank everyone. And one particular point I want to highlight, this effort has been a culmination of a huge team effort. A lot of my team members are sitting here. They may be invisible, but it was because of their efforts, dedicated hard work for the last 7-8 months that we were able to pull this together. So I would like to say a huge round of applause to my entire team under the leadership of Vat that managed to produce this very timely report. In a sense, it's a major global issue at the moment being talked about at various platforms. So thank you very much, colleagues, and a big round of applause from my end for you.
Okay. No?
Not much for me. I mean, please have a look at the full report. If you have any questions, there are email that you can, or you can phone. And also don't forget to play around with our debt dashboard, which is, I hope, can be useful for the wider audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vat. Thank you again, Hamza. And again, thank you to our previous guests, the Finance Minister of Thailand, as well as the Executive Secretary of ESCAP. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance here in the room and online on Zoom. We hope you found this interesting. And again, we do invite you to submit any other additional questions you have to our colleagues at the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division. I believe they can probably share the email, the general email to everybody online if there are any subsequent follow-ups. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.